The Battle of Jutland, fought from May 31st to June 1st, 1916, was the largest naval battle of World War I and even today is still one of the most significant in maritime history. It's known to the Germans as the Battle of Skagerrak and was the only full-scale confrontation between the British Royal Navy's Grand Fleet and the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet. The battle occurred off the Jutland Peninsula in the North Sea near Denmark, involving approximately 250 warships and 100,000 sailors. While both sides claimed victory, Britain for maintaining strategic control of the seas and Germany for inflicting greater losses upon the British, in the end it seems to have been the British who came out on top, as, throughout the duration of much of the war, Britain would come to control the North Sea and the Atlantic. The Battle of Jutland was the culmination of a decades-long naval rivalry between Britain and Germany. Britain, the world's foremost naval power since the Napoleonic Wars, had used the Royal Navy to secure trade routes across the globe and maintain an empire stretching from Canada to Egypt down to the Cape of Good Hope and east to India and Hong Kong and even unto Oceania. The introduction of the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, which was a revolutionary battleship with superior speed, armor, and firepower, sort of redefined naval warfare and ended up sparking a race to build similar dreadnoughts in Germany. The Germans, under Kaiser Wilhelm II and Grand Admiral Alfred von Tippitz, wanted to both complement and challenge British dominance by expanding its high seas fleet. Initially, the Kaiser believed Britain could be an ally of theirs to check French and Russian power, as Britain was competing with Russia in Central Asia in what was known as the Great Game over Afghanistan, Persia, Tibet, and even India. Britain was also seemingly somewhat competitive with France over colonial ventures in India, Africa, and elsewhere, with whom they had historically been both adversarial and friendly at different points. Germany was threatened by France in the west, which harbored revanchist ambitions to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, a German territory which they lost during the Franco-Prussian War. And Germany was also threatened by Russia in the east, who it seemed was industrializing to re-exert a dominant influence over the Balkans and compete with Germany's ally of Austria-Hungary. Kaiser Wilhelm, to this end, extended assistance to the British during the Boer War, and initially framed Germany's naval expansion as a means to assist Britain in pursuing what was believed to be their mutual interest. However, Germany and Britain really weren't meant to be allies. In fact, in the economic realm, they were fierce competitors. Germany and Britain competed in steel, chemicals, and other industrial output, and even though Germany didn't boast a massive resource-rich colonial empire like the British did, through trade with American nations like Chile, Argentina, the United States, and Brazil, among other partners around the globe, particularly in Scandinavia and the lowlands, they managed to outpace the British in certain markets. They also started to ruffle British feathers in the colonial realm, with quarrels over Morocco and China. Germany and Britain thus engaged in what is now known as the naval arms race between 1905 and 1914, during which the German Empire's defense budget surged by 142%. But by 1914, Britain still held a numerical advantage, with 28 dreadnoughts and 9 battle cruisers to Germany's 16 dreadnoughts and 5 battle cruisers. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 let this rivalry truly wreak havoc upon one another. Britain imposed a blockade across the North Sea, cutting Germany off from vital imports like food, nitrates, and raw materials. This blockade was enforced by the Grand Fleet based at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, and it was built to starve Germany's war machine and civilian population. The German High Seas Fleet based at Wilhelmshaven was thus confined to the North Sea, unable to break the blockade without risking a direct confrontation. As naval historian Nick Hewitt of the Orkney Islands Council noted, without imported raw materials and food, Germany could only fight for a year or two before facing starvation and industrial failure. And this was correct. Germany eventually faced the turnip winter and ran out of raw materials to fund their war machine. Thus, for the first 2 years of the war, major fleet actions from the Germans were limited due to the blockade and British control of the North Sea. The German Navy thus adopted an inventive, more cautious strategy to minimize their losses, relying on U-boat submarines and smaller skirmishes like the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, and also experimenting with the use of Zeppelins to import resources from German colonies, which I've talked about in an old, slightly embarrassingly poor quality video on German sky pirates in the war. Anyway, by 1916, the blockade's economic toll pushed Germany to act decisively or really starve out. Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who was appointed commander of the High Seas Fleet in January 1916, decided to get aggressive. Scheer's plan was to lure a portion of the British fleet into a trap, destroy it, and weaken the Brits' numerical superiority, thereby easing the blockade. Unbeknownst to Scheer, however, the British actually had a critical advantage in the form of intelligence. The Admiralty's Room 40 had actually cracked German naval codes, allowing them to monitor German communications. When Scheer planned a sortie for late May 1916, British codebreakers intercepted and partially decoded the orders, alerting Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet, to the impending operation. This intelligence was what set the stage for what would, until 1944, be known as the largest naval battle in history. Now we're going to give a quick recounting of the battle, but if you don't want to hear that and just want to skip straight to the alternate history, be sure to take a look at the timestamps in the description to jump right ahead. Now, the German plan for the Battle of Jutland was intended to be a very sophisticated ambush. Scheer wanted to use German Vice Admiral Franz Hipper's battle cruisers to raid the British coast, drawing out British Vice Admiral Sir David Beattie's own battlecruiser fleet from the Firth of Forth, north of Edinburgh in Scotland. Hipper would then tactically retreat, luring Beattie into the path of Commander Scheer's main fleet, which was to trail 50 miles behind. The main German fleet consisted of 16 dreadnoughts, 6 pre-dreadnoughts, which were just big ships built before the dreadnought program, 5 battle cruisers, 11 light cruisers, and 63 destroyers. Submarines were also positioned to weaken Beattie's forces, and Zeppelins were deployed for reconnaissance, though poor weather limited their effectiveness. But the British, knowing the German plan, planned a counter-trap. British Admiral Jellicoe, who the Germans of course didn't account for, but who had received foreknowledge of the plan, set out with a force of 24 battleships and 3 battle cruisers, while Beattie sailed from Rosyth with 6 battle cruisers and the 5th Battle Squadron's 4 fast battleships. In total, the Grand Fleet, preparing to ambush the German ambush, numbered 28 battleships, 9 battle cruisers, 8 armored cruisers, 26 light cruisers, 78 destroyers, 1 mine layer, and 1 seaplane carrier, making the British fleet 151 warships against Germany's 99. The commanders on both sides were highly experienced and well respected, but distinct in their tactical approaches. British Admiral Sir Jellicoe, later described by Winston Churchill as the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon, in reference to how important his position as Admiral of the Grand Fleet was. By nature of his post, he was cautious and methodical, and he was known particularly for the prioritization of, above most else, the preservation of his fleet. Again, very cautious. Beattie, his deputy, was much more aggressive, and he favored more bold action. The German Vice Admiral Scheer was described as strategic and opportunistic, almost Bismarckian in nature, and Vice Admiral Hipper ran his fleet again by the Prussian books. So the battle itself unfolded in 4 main phases over 2 days: the run to the south, the run to the north, the main fleet action, and the night action. This first phase began with a chance encounter at 2:20 p.m. on May 31st, when British light cruisers HMS Galeta and Phaeton and German torpedo boats spotted a neutral Danish steamer, the N.J. Fjord, and investigated it. At 2:28 p.m., Galeta fired the first shot, signaling enemy in sight, and Beattie's cruisers, 5 miles ahead of his main force, engaged Hipper's scouting group, which included 5 battle cruisers. The British were silhouetted against a bright sky and thus were at a visibility disadvantage, while the Germans were shrouded in mist. At 3:48 p.m., the squadrons opened fire, initiating a 55-minute gun battle. German gunnery proved superior, and at 4 p.m., HMS Indefatigable was hit by German shells, detonating its ammunition magazines and sinking with over 1,000 men. At 4:26 p.m., HMS Queen Mary suffered a similar fate, exploding after a salvo, which is a large volley of artillery, from SMS Zittilz. Beatty famously remarked, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." These losses cost over 2,000 British lives and would actually be a major lesson for British shipbuilders who had, before the battle, compromised British armor for speed. Now, Hipper's task was to lure Beatty south toward Scheer's main fleet, and he succeeded in this. By 4:43 p.m., Beatty signaled the High Seas Fleet and realized the trap. He then ordered a 16-point turn to retreat north, drawing the Germans toward Jellicoe's Grand Fleet, beginning what would become the run to the north. As Beatty fled, pursued by Scheer's dreadnoughts, the British 5th Battle Squadron, including HMS Warspite and Malaya, engaged the Germans. Poor signaling from Beatty's flagship, the HMS Lion, caused confusion, leaving the 5th Battle Squadron temporarily exposed. Meanwhile, Jellicoe, 65 miles north, steamed south to rendezvous with Beatty, preparing to deploy the Grand Fleet. This phase was a tactical success for the Germans, who believed they were chasing a smaller force to destruction. However, Jellicoe was closing in, and around 6 p.m., Beatty joined Jellicoe, allowing the Grand Fleet to form into a line of battle, aiming to cross the T of Scheer's fleet, a maneuver that would allow the British to concentrate fire on the German vanguard. Jellicoe's formation of 96 ships surrounded 59 German vessels in a V-shape, giving the British superior visibility as the sun set. At 6:33 p.m., HMS Invincible, part of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, exploded after hits from German shells, killing nearly all aboard. Despite this loss, Jellicoe's maneuvering outgunned the Germans. Scheer, realizing his fleet was outnumbered, executed a daring battle turn away, which is a synchronized reversal under fire, to escape. As German battle cruisers and torpedo boats advanced to cover the retreat, Jellicoe, wary of torpedo attacks, ordered his fleet to turn away, missing a chance to pursue. Scheer attempted a second engagement, but was again outnumbered by Jellicoe, who crossed his T once more. Scheer then ordered another battle turnaway, and by 8 p.m., darkness and poor visibility halted any further major actions. Jellicoe made again the cautious decision not to chase, as he feared German sea mines and torpedoes, which is a decision that has been debated ever since as to its efficacy and whether or not Jellicoe could perhaps have completely crippled the German high seas fleet. As Churchill again noted, Jellicoe's restraint ensured he did not lose the war or the battle itself, though the British again lost the opportunity to perhaps completely cripple the German navy. The final phase of the battle, the night phase, was chaotic, with smaller engagements between cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats. Jellicoe tried to block Scheer's escape routes to the Jadebusen or Horn's Reef. However, the British Admiralty failed to relay intelligence about Scheer's request for airship reconnaissance at Horn's Reef, causing Jellicoe to steer too far to the south. The Germans exploited this, slipping through the British lines, and British cruisers, including the HMS Defence and HMS Warrior, thus came under heavy fire, with Defence sinking and Warrior heavily damaged. Other German ships were scuffled to avoid capture, and by 3 a.m. on June 1st, Scheer's fleet reached the safety of German minefields, evading further pursuit. Thus, the bloodiest naval battle of the Great War had ended. The British lost 14 ships, including 3 battle cruisers, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers, with 6,094 killed, 674 wounded, and 177 captured. The Germans lost 11 ships, including 1 battleship, 1 battle cruiser, 4 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers, with 2,551 killed and 507 wounded. On June 2nd, German authorities announced a victory of the Skagerrak, withholding releasing the records of their losses to bolster morale. The Kaiser declared a new chapter in world history has begun. In Britain, the public, who expected effectively a second Trafalgar and the total decimation of the German fleet, were disappointed. The press initially actually called it a British defeat, but almost immediately this sentiment actually reversed. As the Globe newspaper later put it, there was one test, and only one, of victory. Who held the field of battle at the end of the fight. And they weren't entirely wrong. Strategically, Jutland was a British victory. The Grand Fleet retained control of the North Sea, preserving the blockade that crippled Germany's economy. The German High Seas Fleet never again challenged the Royal Navy in major engagement, remaining largely in port as a fleet in being. Scheer, in his July 4th report, admitted even the most favorable issue of a battle on the high seas will not compel England to make peace. Germany thus shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, targeting Allied shipping and, of course, risking American entry into the war, which proved decisive after the United States joined the Great War on the side of the British. Jutland also marked the twilight of battleship-centric warfare. As one analysis noted, the development of the submarine, mine, and torpedo illustrated the irrelevance of battleship fleets. In World War II, aircraft carriers and submarines would dominate oceanic warfare, rendering dreadnoughts obsolete within 3 decades of their hail. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Germany decisively won at the Battle of Jutland? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your Legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Star Galaxy, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alfonso Maurice, PJ the Homeless Mage, Chance Bowman, Justin Ambrew, Dark X, Scott Williams, Kennedy the V, Rex Ferris, History with Troy, C. Zachary Myers, Grim Reaper KL, Matthew Jelly, and Papa Stalin. Thank you, and enjoy the video. Now, to begin, a German victory at Jutland must first be defined beyond what historically actually occurred. In order to serve as a total German victory, the High Seas Fleet must close the gap with the Grand Fleet, which had 28 battleships and 9 battlecruisers to Germany's 16 and 6, and the blockade must be lifted to sustain Germany's war effort. Perhaps we can say that somehow Jellicoe is removed from the British equation, whether dying or facing a medical crisis or something of the sort, and then Beatty would replace him, who was less experienced and had greater recklessness, which would turn the fleet into the German torpedo spread, so to speak. So in this hypothetical, Germany would sink, again, in order for this to be a total victory for the German Empire, 15 British capital ships, which we can break down into something like 6 battle cruisers, 4 fast battleships, 3 dreadnoughts, and 2 additional battle cruisers, while perhaps losing none, akin to the Tsushima-sized victory, which is a reference to Japan's 1905 annihilation of the Russian fleet during the Russo-Japanese War that German Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted it to be. This would reduce the Grand Fleet to 19 capital ships against Germany's 21, which would shift the balance of power on the high seas and really serve as something of a Russo-Japanese war for the West, seeing the until then lesser regarded naval power of Germany beat the bigger and mightier British Royal Navy. Of course, this hypothetical is totally unrealistic given the British code breaking that privied them to the attack and the disparity between British and German forces, but there are some factors that we can point to perhaps make this hypothetical more plausible. For example, the near destruction of HMS Lion early in the battle could have had a cascading effect, with the German guns overwhelming Beatty's battlecruisers, causing disarray and sinking all 6 plus the 5th Battle Squadron's 4 battleships. Scheer, in his post-battle notes, stated that he believed it was actually possible for the Germans to have targeted and isolated Jellicoe's additional dreadnoughts in our own history. So, without Jellicoe, perhaps if Scheer takes some more risk, there can be a greater payoff for the Germans. We might also suggest a greater reliance on submarines and submarine traps or mass torpedo attacks, which might have been more effective. But regardless of how it happens, for the sake of our scenario, we'll assume this victory would leave the British Grand Fleet quite crippled, with Germany's High Seas Fleet relatively intact, achieving temporary numerical parity or superiority on the North Sea. But temporary is the key word. The loss of 15 capital ships and thousands of sailors would be a national catastrophe for Britain, their own sort of Trafalgar in reverse. Public morale was already strained by the land battle of the Somme losses, and so now it would certainly plummet. However, could this loss really shock the British public into demanding an end to the war? Probably not. The pre-war maritime rivalry had the British public thoroughly anti-German, and capitulation really is unlikely in 1916 or 17 at all. However, political pressure could easily oust Prime Minister Asquith earlier, accelerating David Lloyd George's rise to the position. But again, the word temporary is important here. The Royal Navy would of course be forced to retreat to Scapa Flow to lick its wounds, but Britain had 2 dreadnoughts and 1 battlecruiser in reserve. And they actually had 5 more capital ships due by year's end, which would give them 26 battleships and 4 battlecruisers in due time against Germany's 18 battleships and 6 battlecruisers, assuming minimal German losses. So even in this sort of best-case scenario for Germany, the British Royal Navy would remain a formidable force and still outnumber the German fleet. Jutland's losses also exposed to British shipbuilders the vulnerabilities of their battlecruisers like magazine explosions, and this defeat would, just as the battle in our own history, allow them to improve their ships with safer shell handling and better armor. The greatest wound to the British would actually come from the thousands of trained soldiers who were now dead, as it would take years to find replacements, as the men who knew how to operate the complex machines on those ships would mostly be either deceased or still in training. Of course, Germany would immediately celebrate this historic victory, as the Kaiser, who revered battleships from his childhood visits to British naval yards, would proclaim this to be Germany's own new Trafalgar, and propaganda would tout the battle as proof of German naval superiority, boosting civilian and military morale, and potentially delaying or erasing the 1918 naval mutinies that crippled the High Seas Fleet. And the High Seas Fleet would also gain operational freedom, as Scheer and Hipper could sortie more aggressively, as the British would now be more cautious, and the High Seas Fleet would have more prestige behind their sails. This victory would also elevate Germany's global prestige, which could possibly sway neutral nations like Brazil to remain neutral and not join the Entente like they had in our history, though this wouldn't have a massive effect on the war. But the most important effect out of all of this is the fate of the North Sea Blockade. Cruisers and destroyers enforced the blockade, and even with this defeat at the Battle of Jutland, Britain retains cruisers and destroyers in abundance. So even with 15 capital ships sunk, Britain's 78 destroyers and 26 light cruisers going up against Germany's 63 and 11 could maintain patrols and thus maintain the blockade. A weakened Grand Fleet might reduce the efficiency of the blockade, because German escorts might still be able to sufficiently protect merchant ships, slightly increasing supplies of food and nitrates imported, but this still means that even with the technical superiority in the North Sea, Germany still can't break the blockade, which means they're still likely to lose the war. The blockade in our own history caused severe shortages by as early as 1916, with German civilian deaths from malnutrition reaching 300,000 by 1918. Germany's disadvantageous geographic position and Britain's global resources from its empire would limit what victory the Germans could even achieve in this scenario. The most we might see is Germany's extra naval assets, allowing it to last a bit longer, with perhaps Germany's 1918 spring offensive succeeding, possibly forcing a little bit more of a negotiated peace depending on how long they can stave off rebellions and government collapse. But regardless, Britain and France outproduced Germany in artillery, tanks, and aircraft by 1918. And Germany's economy, which was 25% smaller than Britain's and, of course, still blockaded, couldn't sustain a longer war. A total victory at Jutland thus could perhaps soften the blow to Germany and allow the Treaty of Versailles to remain perhaps less punitive, but overall that's not incredibly interesting. However, it does beg the question of a much less realistic hypothetical, which is, what if Germany completely destroyed the Royal Navy at Jutland? This is, of course, impossible from a physical standpoint, but for the sake of the hypothetical, for the sake of a thought experiment, let's assume a scenario wherein Germany manages to completely destroy the entire British Grand Fleet sent to the Battle of Jutland, which is all 151 warships. Once again, this scenario doesn't make sense, but it does give us some perhaps tangential insight into the naval balance of power and also the importance of the blockade and the Royal Navy in winning World War I for the Entente. So in this hypothetical, the loss of the Grand Fleet, and even worse, up to 150,000 sailors, is, putting it lightly, the end of the world for Britain's war effort. Public morale would completely erode, riots or at the very least protests could erupt in London, and anti-war sentiment would surge. The Grand Fleet's destruction would decimate Britain's imperial identity. Prime Minister Asquith would probably resign and thus be replaced by David Lloyd George, whose government would itself slash Western Front funding, redirecting resources to coastal defenses and then maintaining the colonial empire, which would of course weaken the Entente Somme offensive, and the Royal Navy, which would now be reduced to a measly 12 capital ships, would be forced to even abandon Scapa Flow, retreating to Plymouth. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of this, as in the previous hypothetical, is that Britain cannot immediately train men to crew new ships, and thus naval operations and also merchant marine operations would be paralyzed. Replacing them en masse would require pulling instructors from academies like Dartmouth and training merchant seamen or even colonial volunteers, but this process alone could take up to 18 to 24 months at a minimum, leaving any new vessels, such as the 5 dreadnoughts under construction at Vickers and Armstrong, sitting idle or crewed by green hands prone to mishaps. In the interim, Britain's maritime empire would be exposed like never before, which would force a quick and likely inefficient reallocation of resources from the army's offensives in the Western Front to coastal fortifications, anti-raider patrols, rebuilding the navy itself, and using whatever vessels remained, most of which would be armed merchant cruisers or obsolete ships pulled from reserve. The immediate question thus arises, the same one we asked in the last hypothetical: would the British blockade of Germany be shattered? And finally we can answer in the affirmative: it would fracture almost immediately. Scheer's High Seas Fleet is now the unchallenged master of the North Sea, impeded only by minefields and minimal resistance. This fleet could tactically shift toward a more aggressive stance, sweeping aside the lighter blockade forces in a series of mopping up operations. Additionally, without the blockade, Germany can now escort its own convoys through the Skagerrak and Kattegat, reopening trade routes to Scandinavia and beyond. Now, this wouldn't mean an overnight flood of goods, as Germany's merchant mariner had been decimated early in the war, with many ships interned in neutral ports, but it would allow for a gradual resumption of imports, extending German endurance before the internal strains we saw in our own history, like the turnip winter, came to fully manifest. The real question is, where would Germany now be able to buy resources from? And further, would neutral powers, particularly the United States, even decide to trade with such a suddenly ascendant Germany? Even America's pre-1917 commerce was heavily tilted toward the Entente, with exports to Britain and France ballooning from $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion by 1917, including loans from banks like JP Morgan that totaled over $2 billion to the Entente versus a mere $27 million to Germany, largely because, as we mentioned, the blockade made direct trade with Central Powers impractical. So America seems to not be an immediate option. In the Americas, however, Germany could easily pivot to sourcing nitrates from Chile, where it had pre-war ties through various liner companies, importing guano and saltpeter, which were essential for explosives, and foodstuffs from Argentina and Brazil, whose beef and grain exports had been curtailed by British pressure that is now absent. Now, in our own history, Wilson's administration was anti-interventionist at the start of the war, and this really wouldn't change until unrestricted submarine warfare started to really affect America in mid-1917, with America joining in April of that same year. Throughout that period, Britain's propaganda machine had appealed to a shared Anglo-American civilization and painted Germany as a barbaric force after incidents like the sack of Louvain. Wilson himself tacitly approved of this propaganda as he began to favor a more moralistic intervention to, quote, keep the world safe for democracy, as he put it. And with regard to the political ramifications of this scenario, in this alternate timeline, only one piece of that equation with regard to Wilson's stance and America's stance is really removed, that being unrestricted submarine warfare. After Jutland in our own history, German naval strategy shifted from above-surface operations to mostly submarine operations, something that is now not likely to be the case, as Scheer will have freer rein to emulate von Tippett's pre-war vision of what he called a risk fleet, conducting surface raids on British East Coast ports like those at Scarborough in 1914, but scaled up to disrupt coal shipments from Newcastle, a vital artery for Britain's war and civil industries that exported 40 million tons annually before 1914. So with German surface superiority now, the fleet could escort big merchant raiders into the Atlantic, negating the need for unrestricted submarine warfare. And even though this would kind of be the only change in the American calculus, this is a really big change, as these raiders can now see what flagships are flying and direct their efforts towards war shipments rather than neutral shipping, including American shipping, which the submarines had a problem with given it was difficult to identify the ship one was targeting, which is why the Germans adopted the risky, unrestricted doctrine that simply stated that the U-boats should take out any ships they encounter. So with this change, submarines will now serve supplementary roles and mine-laying in British harbors, which also tangentially echoes how the Japanese and the Russo-Japanese War used torpedoes in support of battleships at Tsushima. Again, Tsushima being a model that both Scheer and Wilhelm wrote that they admired. Germany could even, in this timeline, experiment with combined arms, integrating Zeppelins for reconnaissance more effectively than even at Jutland, where weather hampered their effectiveness, but we're getting off topic here. The main point is that the removal of unrestricted submarine warfare from the equation is a big piece of the puzzle, as it minimizes the risk of incidents like the Lusitania that really galvanized public opinion against Germany and provided the United States with a casus belli to actually join the war, rather than simply sentiment among the ruling classes of the United States. But of course, as we mentioned, it doesn't mean at all that America is on Germany's side. In fact, if the Germans begin to target British shipping, or even impose a blockade on the British and French, which is something we'll get to in a bit, this would likely actually lead to the Americans imposing export controls or embargoes on strategic goods to actively hinder the Kaiser's war machine, because again, America relied on the Entente for trade and had a vested interest in getting them to pay back those war debts. Still, opportunistic American businesses are nonetheless likely to at least initially exploit the vacuum that a broken blockade would bring. For instance, Ford Motor Company, which had assembly plants in Europe, could ship more vehicles to Germany through neutral ports, and raw cotton exporters from the south, who were hurting from Britain's pivot to sourcing cotton from their plantations in India. And they could find new markets for American cotton in Hamburg or elsewhere. We might also see a bit of a divide between the German-American populations of the Midwest and other areas that are benefiting from reopened German trade with America and the coastal elites, who would be much closer tied to the Entente and their finances and British cultural, economic, and political influence. Such a situation could actually just fuel isolationist sentiments in Congress even more, because no one would really want to go against their constituents and take a side that might be unpopular with a large subsect of the population. And this would come much to the chagrin of the British, and perhaps Wilson as well, because it could keep America out of the war, even if economically it would fall closer to the Entente. There are some ripple effects here also on neutral European powers like Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands, which would be a bit more profound, transforming them from intermediaries into what would essentially become vital lifelines for Germany in terms of the economics. Historically, these nations had to deal with a very precarious neutrality, as Norway lost over 2,000 sailors to U-boat attacks despite its non-belligerence in the war, and Sweden exported iron ore to Germany through the Baltic, thus facing British minefields being planted in its waters. And Sweden really is the big player here in this scenario, as their vast ore deposits in Kiruna could now flow unimpeded to German steel mills, increasing production there and sustaining the Hindenburg program's munitions drive even longer. Norway is also a big player in this alternate scenario, as it holds the fourth largest merchant fleet in the world, and will very soon see a big boom in chartering ships to Germany, evading British reprisals that historically actually sank half of Norwegian tonnage in the First World War. This would also help the Norwegian whaling and fishing industries, exporting herring and cod to Berlin to supplement their food shortages, and probably politically tilting Oslo toward Germany through economic incentives like coal swaps. We'd also see the Netherlands benefit immensely. Before the war, Dutch ports like Rotterdam handled much of Germany's overseas commerce, as the Netherlands was quite reliant on the Rhine for its economy. And in this scenario, they could resume as a transshipment hub for South American goods, enriching Dutch traders and sending those resources over to Germany. This would of course come at the cost of straining relations with Britain, which could perhaps lead to a formal protest or even British raids on Dutch shipping, but the economic incentives could still outweigh the risks. It is worth it to note, however, that the Dutch in particular worked very hard to maintain political independence from the German sphere, and they, in particular, are the most likely of these three neutrals to appease the British if protested. Now, in response to all of this, Britain would be compelled to overhaul its naval doctrine, shifting from Mahanayan decisive battle concepts named after American theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, who liked to put a particular emphasis on fleet concentration, all moving to a more asymmetric defensive posture. What we could end up seeing, actually, is a bit of a mirror image of our own history's naval tactics, with the British beginning to accelerate submarine production, drawing from the lessons of the Dardanelles, where subs like E-11 wreaked havoc there, to harass German patrols in the North Sea. Quite the turned tables from our own history. We'd also see harder British coastal defenses, with mine barrages expanding from Dover to the Orkneys, and Q-ships, which refer to disguised merchant raiders, also becoming more commonplace to lure and ambush isolated German cruisers. Alliances would factor in too. Germany might employ Japan, its ally through the 1902 Anglo-Japanese Treaty, to dispatch dreadnoughts from the Pacific, though Japan's focus on controlling their seized German colonies, like Tsingtao, could limit how much aid they could actually provide, especially if doctrinally they don't see a need to assist Britain in the European theater. The furthest west the Japanese participated in World War I in our own history was in the Indian Ocean to escort patrols and merchant ships. And I don't particularly see Japan abiding by the Anglo-Japanese Treaty to really this extent. On the other hand, France's fleet, which was historically confined to the Mediterranean, could be implored to redeploy northward, but its obsolescent battleships would be easily outmatched if they engaged with the Germans. Crew shortages would force a reliance on things like convoy systems for Atlantic trade, something that with the Americans neutral would be harder to sustain, especially given how offensive this new German tactical doctrine would be. In fact, these surface operations from Germany could, as we alluded to earlier, culminate in a German-imposed blockade on Britain and France, really, again, turning the tables from our own history, with the Germans stationing squadrons to interdict Entente shipping. It's harder to blockade Britain and France than it is to blockade Germany, given there isn't a great chokehold like there is for German shipping in the North Sea and the Channel, but it is possible for the Germans to sustain strategically placed blockade forces that would either turn away shipping from the Isles or possibly force the British to rely on ports not suited for large imports, while simultaneously still facing the burn of raiding operations across the Atlantic and North Sea. This would spike British import costs, and everything coming from Canada, Australia, America, all over the place would get more expensive, and at the same time British markets would face shortages, with rationing probably hitting London and Manchester and everywhere really hard, and fueling what would probably come to be some sort of unprecedented labour unrest in Britain. Bombardments could also cripple things like fish supplies and coal exports, and all of this would exacerbate British inflation that had historically already reached 25% by 1917 in our own history. This would of course affect American business with Britain, who was, again, America's foremost trade partner, which may compel Wilson to actually try to mediate or propose an armistice conference. But in the private sector, American companies who had already shown their pragmatic capitalism, pivoting from balanced trade in Europe to a more pro-Entente stance back in 1914, might probably now pivot to a dual trading stance, that is, selling steel and other goods to both sides, as they had back in 1914 and 15. This would come with some minor economic fallout, as always, when you try to pivot a market, and also it would be a bit more muddied, because there certainly were Entente-leaning firms like Bethlehem Steel that could very well protest Germany's blockade of the British and French, using lobbying. But overall, the sticky situation would keep the markets on their toes and keep the government neutral, especially as now the Americans would be operating under the geopolitical precedent that the power balance in Europe was subject to intense shifts over short periods of time. It's a loser's game trying to figure out who will wrestle the title of the most powerful economy and foremost navy on the continent from one another in such a short period of time. Again, what this would tell many American politicians is that publicly favoring one side or another would be politically impractical, so no one would want to run the risk of accidentally siding with the losing faction. Isolationists like Senator Robert La Follette, who had vociferously opposed intervention even after the Zimmermann telegrams revelation in early 1917, would find their arguments much better received, especially by the public, as they portrayed this as a European war, a quagmire where no single power could claim the moral high ground, especially with Germany's surface raids appearing at least more quote-unquote honorable than submarine warfare, which Britain would now be sidestepping into. Wilson would also have the opportunity to simply pivot and focus inward on progressive reforms like the 18th Amendment's prohibition laws, the laws against the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol, which historically passed in 1919 even during the war. But of course, what you've probably been waiting for, the broader military theaters would feel the shockwaves of these changes most acutely. Starting in the Western Front, where the Naval offensive, which was planned for April 1917 under General Robert Niville's command, promised a breakthrough against German lines along the Chemin des Dames Ridge. In our timeline, this assault involved over 1.2 million French troops, supported by British diversions at Arras, aiming to recapture the Hindenburg Line with massive artillery barrages and creeping barrages, but it failed, due to poor weather, leaked plans that caused Germany to send reinforcements, and the elastic defense tactics perfected by Erich von Ludendorff, resulting in 187,000 French casualties for very minimal gains by May. This disaster historically precipitated widespread mutinies across 54 French divisions from May to June, where soldiers refused offensive orders but held defensive positions, protesting the abysmal conditions, the futile attacks, and the broken promises of victory within 48 hours, as Nivelle had boasted. Henri-Philippe Pétain, who was the French army chief of staff and after the offensive and the mutinies became the commander-in-chief of the French forces, again historically, quelled those mutinies through around 49 executions of traitors, reforms like better leave and food, and a shift to defensive warfare until American aid arrived, because the Americans had already joined the war by this point. But of course, in this alternate timeline, America hasn't joined the war, and France's vulnerabilities are much worse. They are likely without supplies from Britain, or at least with much less, including coal for French factories and troops from channel ports like Calais, which might force France to reroute imports through southern ports like Marseille, stretching their rail networks that were already quite strained by the aftermath of Verdun and the logistics needed to keep up the war, and thus we'd see worse shortages of munitions, worse shortages of food, and these could turn mutinies into outright revolts, even spreading to civilian strikes in Paris, like what we saw in the historical 1918 metalworkers' actions, but now earlier and more intense, fueled by reports of German cruisers shelling the coasts of Normandy and the absence of any promises or declarations by the Americans. Germany could then capitalize on this by launching counteroffensives to exploit the French disarray, possibly even capturing Reims, or even pushing toward Paris by late 1917. The absence of British naval defenses means German flotillas could harass Entente supply lines in the Channel, disrupting the BEF's reinforcements and logistics, which relied on those cross-channel ferries, and this might even force British General Douglas Haig to cancel or curtail the Third Battle of Ypres, which the Germans referred to as the Passchendaele in the summer of 1917. This was a bloody and destructive battle in the mud and a high-casualty one with horrific conditions. But if it is postponed, this would preserve German reserves for a decisive thrust. I suspect we'll see an armistice with the French by autumn, and broader analysis of the Western Front would reveal a sort of cascading effect precipitating this, as Germany's access to the international market sustained the Hindenburg program longer, producing more artillery shells, allowing Ludendorff to maintain depth in his defensive positions, while probing France's weaknesses, advancing through Flanders without the mud of Ypres bogging them down, as drier logistics from the secure North Sea give them quicker mobilizations, and you just have an all-around really poor situation for the French that would probably end in a sue for peace. Italy might also sue for peace earlier, separately, perhaps ceding Veneto to Austria-Hungary in exchange for neutrality. Romania, if it even joins the war at all, might sign a punitive Bucharest Treaty earlier, ceding Dobruja permanently, and Greece would manage to stay out of the war entirely, preserving Salonika as a neutral port. The East, however, demands a sort of separate scrutiny due to its volatility. We would still have the February Revolution from the bread riots in St. Petersburg, which led to the Tsar's abdication and the provisional government's continuation of the war under Kerensky, but the real question is whether or not the Bolshevik October Revolution still happens. we can assume that broadly Russia might be quicker to collapse, as with the blockade lifted, Germany might ship more arms or even intervene directly through the Baltic, and thus we might see Germany try to prop up the provisional government and meddle in their affairs, as their interests would be aligned against the more radical factions of the Civil War. Brest-Litovsk, I imagine, would still occur in some fashion, but on harsher terms, with Germany perhaps even bringing more into its sphere of influence, like Finland, leveraging naval projection to occupy Murmansk earlier, thwarting Allied interventions there in 1918, and maybe propping up some of the White Armies under Kolchak or Denikin, which could receive submarines for Black Sea operations, delaying any sort of Red consolidation. Russia would still be a total mess, though with all sorts of problems from Cossack separatism to peasant uprisings over land, and the Civil War could perhaps shorten if German aid tips toward the Whites, but any post-war Russian government would be overwhelmed with uprisings and protests, birthing what could be something of a weaker Soviet state besieged by German client regimes in the East. Again, and that's assuming even that the Soviets are able to consolidate power, which is its own can of worms. Now, as for the treaties, France would not have regained Alsace-Lorraine, obviously, and would likely also lose the Brie ironfields, perhaps even losing Morocco as well to a pro-German ruler, facing a buffer zone, demilitarization, war debts, and possibly even being forced to allow German naval basing rights in Brest to facilitate Germany's broader Atlantic maritime control. And Britain would be forced to return German colonies seized like Togoland and Cameroon, recognize perhaps an expansion of Middle Africa with an independent Rhodesia, and now a Belgium subservient to Germany along with demilitarizing the Channel. Austria-Hungary would gain a Serbian puppet, but one which would be nearly impossible to control, and buffers in the east, but would have to deal with a fractured empire facing heavy war exhaustion, with a beat economy that would be dependent on Germany to stay afloat, and Russia, of course, loses more as the Germans formalize a cordon sanitaire of puppet states, which would come to be known as Mittel Europa. A Polish strip, independent Baltics, independent Finland, a puppet state in the Ukraine, all vying against a weak Soviet Union and likely Japanese wars against the Soviet Union over the Far East. Post-war Europe would initially morph into a German-dominated continent, but unlike in our last scenario about a victorious Germany, wherein the Germans won in 1914, this Germany has faced an entire war. It's more exhausted, and worst, it's overextended. It does have a more competent navy, and with it a more competent merchant fleet that can probably sustain Middle Africa for some time, but on the continent, it will be impossible to handle the East, an unstable France, unstable Austria-Hungary, and a Britain that will inevitably be on the rise again very soon. And even if it likely would have to recognize Irish independence and face resistance in India, perhaps even granting it dominion status, even with the help of Bulgaria, a more stable Ottoman Empire, and German-aligned bloc in Scandinavia and the lowlands, Germany, as a polity and as an empire, is overstretched. France will quickly spiral into instability, with revanchist movements and likely the rightists gaining traction, perhaps birthing a Boulanger-style dictatorship by the 1920s, which Germany will not be able to counteract. Russia would be communist, isolationist, and paranoid, with purges targeting suspected German collaborators and, as we mentioned, a war with Japan. Italy could probably still end up fostering irredentism, something that would nurture the ideologies of Mussolini and D'Annunzio, which could come to align with the French against the Germans, all while America retreats back into isolationism. The question thus becomes, what happens to this imbalance of continental order? Germany in the center, France and Italy in the west, Russia in the east, and the British on the periphery. Will the Germans lose their empire? Will a second war break out? Will radical ideologies take over the continent? Or will this odd, frankly quite unusual and imbalanced peace last? And that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with a join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.